They're going to take up some of the material that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the community that was living at Qumran. And part of the problem is it's in fragments. So some of the stuff that we're talking about is a bit speculative, and there are different people who guess one way or another. So we're going to try to go through the material and look at the broadest view of it and then see what they're up to. Let me give you a little historical background about the formation of that community for those of you who may not know about it. Last time in discussing the book of Daniel, we were talking about the fact that Daniel, the author, at least of chapters 7 on, was living in a time when Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian Greek, was in charge of that area. And he decided to impose Greek values upon the Jewish people and simply tried to eliminate the Jewish culture in the process. And Daniel was trying to give hope for those people who were being persecuted by the Syrian Greeks, that God would intervene and take care of them and promise them some solace and hope. Well, it came quickly in a different way. The Maccabean family started a revolt, and their movement led to finally the overthrow of the Syrian Greek army. And through the Maccabean leadership, they took control of their country again. And this is the first celebration of their controlling that was to cleanse the temple and celebrate Hanukkah. While they were doing this, there was a group of priestly families in particular that highly supported the Maccabean revolt because the temple was being decimated and much of the culture was being ruined. And so they were all in favor of trying to get their culture back. And so they were loyal to the Maccabean revolt. But Jonathan Maccabeus, he was the leader of the forces, once they attained victory, declared himself to be high priest. And he didn't have the bloodline or the tradition to be high priest. So some of the priestly families that had supported the revolt now turned against Jonas because they thought that by taking over the role of the high priest, he not only was undermining the tradition, but he was usurping the authority of the priestly line. And therefore the leader, which we never got the name, but a leader who becomes called the teacher of righteousness, begins to criticize the temple, claiming it's being run by people who don't have the authority to run it, and therefore it's been polluted. Well, you can imagine Jonathan Maccabeus didn't like this kind of comment, so they began going after this guy, and the persecution led to this teacher gathering a group of people and exiling themselves to the desert, where they go to Qumran, which is near the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there were ruins there, and they probably rebuilt them up in order to form a community there. So this was primarily a group of priests who go to the desert, claiming that the temple was no longer valid, and they tried to live a holy life of what priestly thought they should do out in the desert, and prepared themselves for what they believed was the coming judgment of God. So they joined the apocalyptic tradition that's in Daniel and Enoch and others, and claimed there was eventually going to be a war between the sons of light, which they saw themselves part of, against the sons of darkness and against the wicked priests who were in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. So this apocalyptic group then divided the world between good and evil and began to wrestle with the problem that eventually they saw angels would come down and help them start the war. They would join the angels, overthrow the wickedness of the earth, and restore the world back to God's good graces. That's the basic outline of what the community was up to. And while they were there, they collected a number of the texts that were available about the scriptures. So when the community's caves where they buried these texts were found, we now have some of the oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament and other intertestamental literature that we've ever had. Before that, we were pretty much in the Middle Ages for texts. So it was an important discovery of what was there. And I want to go through some of the beliefs they had there because they both fit the tradition we've been looking at in the mystic literature, but they have a different take on it too, which is interesting. So we'll look at it. In the fragments that were found there, either the teacher of righteousness wrote this, it could be his point of view, or it could be a leader who had followed him. The community formed somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, and the community lasts down till the year 70 of the 1st century of the Common Era, when the Romans came in, and that was the war that the Romans began to recover the land again, and they decimate the land and, of course, overrun Qumran and eventually Masada, which is near there. Well, the teacher of righteousness, who had been persecuted and had to leave and live out in the desert, writes about his own experience. And in it, he doesn't say he traveled to heaven, but it seems to be implicit that he did something, because let me read to you from the fragments that they put together, and it's called the Self-Glorification Hymn. It means the individual writing this is bragging about who he is and what he's gone through. This is the opening of this particular section. I am reckoned with the angels. My dwelling is in the holy council. I don't know if you get what that line is saying. The author is saying that he now lives with the angels. He's part of the heavenly world. And as such, he has been made a member of the heavenly congregation. I can only imagine he must have had a vision where he travels up there, sees himself aligned with the angelic beings and merges with them. That's before he comes back. But then he goes on to say, who has been accountable despicable like me? And who has been despised like me? And who has been shunned by men like me? And who compares me to enduring evil? All those negative things are, of course, the fact that he was persecuted. And the persecution is what let him out. It's interesting, that language also is a part of the language of the suffering servant in Isaiah, where Isaiah talks about the people suffering and they will be healed through the suffering of, and it becomes a messianic message in 2nd Isaiah. And here the author of this text, who's probably the leader of the community, is talking about the fact that he's gone through all of these suffering and persecution, and yet at the same time, he's now with the angels. Psychologically, I see what's happening. He's had all this negative stuff said about him by the culture in which he lived. He's now living a sectarian existence in the desert. And to compensate for all the negative stuff, the deeper positive side of his self has come out. And he now identifies himself with the values of the angels who are in heaven. So you can see the imagery is compensating, in effect, for the negative stuff that's being said about him. He now sees himself through the imagery to be part of the heavenly world, and therefore gain some kind of authority and status by doing so. Let me go on with what he has to say. No teaching compares to my teaching, For I sit in heaven. Who is like me among the angels? Who would cut me off when I open my mouth? And who could measure the flow of my lips? Who can associate me in speech and thus compare with my judgment? For I am the beloved of the King, God, a companion of the holy ones, angels, and no one can accompany me. So at this point, he is the individual who has gone. He sees himself. It's very much like what we saw in the Daniel passage. Remember, a heavenly being comes up and sits on the throne next to God, who is given control over things. Well, he has gone up. He becomes the beloved of the King. And now he's a teacher. But what he's teaching, he says, is what he gained when he was information in heaven. So this is typical of what we've seen from Ezekiel, from Enoch, and others. They go to heaven. This gives them authority. They gain knowledge and insight up there, and they are commissioned to take this knowledge back to the human world and reveal it. And that's what he's saying. He's gone there. He's been beloved by the King. He's part of the council in heaven. He now is on earth, and he's now going to teach the others and form a community based on what he's learned. And so he then says, and to my glory. No, remember the word glory or kavod was the emanation coming out of God. It was God's light and all of that they saw in glory. It's an important word in Paul's language too. He now sees he has been given part of this light, this glory, and he says, no one compare, for my station is with the angels, and my glory with the sons of the King, and other angels. Neither with gold will I crown myself or refound. So he has elevated himself in importance and has become part of the heavenly world. And this has given him the authority to become the teacher and the leader of the community. And it's out of that kind of experience that he now becomes the central leader for the people who lived at Qumran. So much of the language here that he's talking about is part of the traditional language that we've seen in the other mystical tradition. Before I go forward, are there any comments or questions about that? Stephen?
Just the way he talks, I would think maybe in the modern day, this guy might be, running for president or something. He seems like, I could see where he's setting himself up as the leader of his particular cult, but having so much of this directed at he himself when it goes through, if I was just reacting to seeing something like that, I'd be very suspicious if this didn't have very much to do with a revelation, but would be sort of a power prestige grab by this guy because it's so self-directed. I think more than what we read previously.
Yeah, obviously he must have been some kind of a charismatic leader. And so that this message fits him in the tradition. This isn't the first time anybody's made these kinds of claims about being in heaven and seeing visions. So that's not particularly unusual. And whoever his followers were must have accepted the fact that he had that kind of authority and vision. So, if somebody came down the street and told us about that, we'd probably call the police or something. But this was part of their culture, so it wasn't all that particularly crazy. But there's another step that comes after this that I think builds on this experience, which becomes part of the central thesis of this community. In some of the other documents that come out for the community, called the Thanksgiving Scrolls, something unusual happens that we haven't seen up to this point. Up to this point, it's individuals like the one I just said, or like Ezekiel or Enoch or whoever. It's individuals who go up, see the vision, they get commissioned, they come back down. But the community at Qumran believed they collectively together merge with the angels. That's their vision of things. And so in the Thanksgiving hymns, we begin to see the first kind of clues of a congregational meeting. What happens when people get together to worship together, and what is emerging from it? And for this community which is alienated from the culture that they come from and from the temple, so they want to live as if they were living in a perfect temple. But the vision tradition from which they come says the true temple is in heaven. And the angels in heaven are the priests who celebrate and worship up there. And the true sacrifice is not in Jerusalem, but in heaven. And as a community, their concern is to become part of that heavenly reality. And that's the vision that comes. So let me read you a couple of the Thanksgiving hymns that are central to this community. This is probably a song or hymn that was either said by everybody in the group, so that even though you have a first person singular pronoun, everybody was saying this as part of the community. I thank you, Lord, because you saved my life from the pit, from Sheol and Abaddon, and have lifted me up to an everlasting height so that I can walk on a boundless plain. The community, which had a very strict moral code, most of them were ascetics of one kind or another and practiced celibacy. Not everybody, but most of them did. And they saw themselves as specially redeemed by God, that their life in the desert was something that God had asked them to do, in effect, and by doing so purified them so they could be prepared for the new life that was to come. So they are thanking God for the fact that they have attained a kind of purity which the rest of the world doesn't have, especially those awful people running the temple in Jerusalem. And then it goes on. And I know there is hope for someone you fashioned out of clay, for humans, to be an everlasting community. Well, what does it mean to be an everlasting community? The only everlasting community in the vision is up in heaven. And so they see humans somehow now in the capacity to be part of that heavenly vision. That's what they're looking for. And they say, the corrupt spirit you have purified from great sin, so that I can take my place with the host of the holy ones. I take my place with the holy ones. That's the angels. Their place is with them. Now you can do it one of two ways. Either when the community is worshiping together as a group, they see the angels come down and become part of their group, or in the vision, while they're worshiping, they go into a trance or something and then see themselves part of the heavenly world. Don't know which way it's going, but it could go either way. In any case, the main thing is they've attained communion with the angels. This is the name of the community. They call themselves the community of union. And the union that they feel is not only with each other, but with those who are responsible for the celebration of God in heaven, the angels. So, they have with the host of the, and can enter communion with the congregations of the sons of heaven. That's the angels. You cast eternal destiny for man with the spirits of knowledge, so that he praises your name together in celebration and tells of your wonders before all your works. They get information, just like any other visions we've seen. When they get into this sense of union with the angels, they get knowledge that doesn't come to everybody else. This is knowledge which tells them how to truly worship God and truly live the life that God wants. All that comes in these hymns that they can, and there's a whole bunch of them, that are celebrating the fact that God has given them this new life and new identity. Let me take you to one other hymn. All the nations will know your truth, and all the peoples your glory. This is probably coming at the end. Everybody will know at the end when the angels come to restore the world again, everyone will know God's glory, the emanation of God. For you have brought your truth and your glory to all men of your council. There's the holy council on earth. The men in the council at Qumran have been given this information in advance. That's what they're saying. And in the lot, together with the angels of the face. The angels of the face are the four major angels in heaven, led by Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, so forth. So they are already linking themselves up with what they thought to be the highest angels in heaven. And what it says is, we can gain this without the need of a mediator to gain insight and intelligence. They don't need Moses. They don't need an earthly leader. They have now become knowledgeable themselves because they've merged with the angels. This gives them a pattern of knowledge and triumph over the ordinary sense of the world. So part of what happens in the Thanksgiving for this community is these hymns bring them together as a group. They gain something in worship together that they can't get individually. That's part of a question I want you to look at later. We're not worshiping together in community. We do it on Zoom or whatever we do it on. What's missing? And what's missing is psychologically the ability to be with each other physically, bodily, if you will, and gain some kind of rapport with one another by being physically present. That's missing. Our bodies are not, in effect, reacting to the presence of other bodies in the same way you can in collective worship. So something's missing, and at Qumran, they began to recognize the enormous value of being together and celebrating together and forming a community of union. That's what they're up to. And their vision is they've taken a vision and become part of the holy scene. They don't merge with God. When you get to the Gospel of Thomas and the Nag Hammadi material, it's getting back to be with God. That's the case. So far, from what we know from the Qumran literature, it's communion with the angels. That's the highest thing that puts them next to God on the throne, but doesn't cross the barrier between human angel life and God's reality, that kind of thing. Comments or questions before we go on to one more facet of this community? Everybody's, yeah, August? Yeah, you got to take off you got to click on your mic so we can hear you.
Okay, there we go. Perhaps because of our absence in the states of Oregon and Washington, or the lack of memory, that you may have addressed this, but what keeps coming up in my mind is the use of language in all of the mystical literature, the guidelines between how to tell that literal in the sense that they are really talking about their experiences, or hyperbole. For example, Martin Luther King said, "I had been to the mountaintop." Well, to me, that was a hyperbole. But what are the guidelines as we separate out this language between the leader of Qumran or some of the other writers that we have, that they are elevating this in an exaggerated way, but they don't mean to say, I really saw this or I was there?
Yeah, I think you're asking a pretty modern question, actually. I'm not sure those distinctions were part of the ancient world, at least for a lot of people. Yeah. There obviously were some who knew the difference between a vision as vision and something literal. But if we go back to Ezekiel, it looks clearly like his vision is in the middle of a trance. So he's having a extrasensory perception or something, which I think he would take as quite real. Now, but that's a good problem. To what extent is this angelic vision an imagination that they're coming up with and they know it's imaginative, or to what extent is it real? I have a feeling they thought it was real, because this is what really gave them confidence in the desert when they had been banished from their culture. So I think if they just thought it was in their imagination, it wouldn't have the same power for them. But from our point of view, yeah, we don't think they really saw angels in heaven and all that. So we would talk about this psychologically as images coming up, which gave them confidence and gave them a sense of purpose and meaning that they otherwise wouldn't have. And that's the value of these images. But they probably took them very seriously. I'm assuming that, obviously we're not there, don't know. But it looks like they really thought people could go up to heaven and see things, either in bodily form or their spirit somehow went up there, brought it, and did it. But it's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer because we weren't there, but I'm just guessing that based on what happened in the community, they took this pretty seriously. And it wasn't just a hyperbole. I don't know if any of the rest of you have a feeling about that, but it's hard to know what they were up to in our, if we translate in our language, that's where we go to up psychology or something else. But I don't think that's where they were.
As I was reading all these visions of going up to heaven, the question I had was, do people have these visions today? And then I thought, well, could it be like a mental illness? And I know the schizophrenics that I've seen are not organized enough to go on a complete journey. They seem to sort of have a little touch of vision and then it leaves. But what do you think of that? Are people having these visions today?
Well, I think there's a pretty consistent element of mystical life that survives in spite of a rational age. And I don't know that any of these the Middle Ages, the mystics thought they saw or were involved with God. But I think current mysticism, you look at spiritual stuff that's being produced by any number of people, whether it be Celtic mysticism or stuff coming out of the Catholic tradition and so forth, the mystics always see themselves as part of the presence of God's reality. And I think when you said about the vision of God being an old man with a beard, which I was thankful because that makes either you or me God. There's a tendency to experience a presence, if you will. Sometimes it's visualized in an image, but often it's simply an overwhelming experience more than that. So I don't know of enough of the literature to know whether people talk about the throne or sitting God on a throne. That probably is not our culture. That was their culture back in those days. And we don't have kings in the country, so it's different. So the images would be different, but there are a great many people who are in the mystical side of the tradition who are claiming that they're having experiences that puts them in direct relationship with this deeper reality. So that's what I hear them talking about, more than the particular image of what's created by it.
Okay.
Some of the rest of you are into spiritual stuff. I don't know what comes out of it. Some of you are into what's his name, Newell's stuff too. There are visions there that come out of this.
Well, I wanted to say something about schizophrenic visions and schizophrenic people in this regard. In most of my experience with people who have schizophrenia, they're not the kind of people you feel like you relate and bond to easily. It's really quite the opposite. They're usually scary. They're usually, as Tom was talking about, much more disorganized when they do this. Often they find these things, visions themselves frightening or disorganized or whatever. Whereas I think you can speculate whether these people have some kind of mental imbalance who have visions, I suppose. But as far as people who describe things in this particular way as a positive kind of experience, and they relate to other people and they share these kind of experiences with them, that isn't really my experience of what the way schizophrenia presents. So I just throwing that out. I think this is a little more.
Yeah. Well, part of the question would be for even us, what if anything do we experience when we are together in worship? What is it that we have? And so much of the mainstream tradition has eliminated the experiential part of worship, that it tends to be more formal and external in a lot of ways. And the more mystical experience of finding yourself, feeling you're in the presence of a reality that's greater than you, that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. A lot of people don't seem to experience that in the churches. That's part of the problem of the secular age. So part of the question mark is that something we experience when we're together? Is it something we find in worship, something that puts us in touch with a reality different and more important than just us individuals? Is there something there? That's the question for the day, I guess. Let me finish up this, and then I can break you into groups and you can talk about this problem with each other, because that's the issue for the day. Another part of the material that was found at Qumran is now known as either the Angelic Liturgy or the songs of the Sabbath, celebration of the Sabbath. These songs of the Sabbath, there are 13 songs that have been found, and they were used on the first 13 Sabbaths of the year. And because the language in these angelic liturgy are not the language typical of the community from other sources, it's possible that this angelic liturgy came from outside. They took it over in Qumran and used it, but it may be from other groups, which means that what's represented in these texts had a wider following than simply at Qumran. But in any case, at Qumran, these hymns were used in their worship services. They were probably chanted collectively. And what's taking place in them is each of the hymns celebrates the angels who are in heaven. Since the worship service and the sacrifice in Jerusalem was considered invalid now, at Qumran, they are encouraging the angels in heaven to perform the sacrament, to praise God. And in the process of talking about angel language and all of the thing that goes on in here, it doesn't say they formed a communion with him as it does in the Thanksgiving hymn, but it's quite clear the way the Qumran community would hear this material would be that by praising the angels, they're bringing out the best that's within them, and hopefully their lives will be part of a pattern which would be the angelic patterns. So in listening to the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, then, what you get is a whole lot of encouragement for the angels. Let's see, where are we here? I want to read you only one, I think, because of time. I'll read you the 12th song that goes in this category. Here. This is, let's see, what page is it on? It's on page 433. Okay, this is the 12th, for the 12th Sabbath. The cherubim, remember these strange creatures that we've seen in other places, Ezekiel and others. The cherubim lie prostrate before him and bless him when they rise. The him is God here. The voice of the divine silence is heard. You hear the conflicting imagery. The voice of silence is heard. And there is an uproar of excitement when they raise their wings, the voice of divine silence. They bless the image of the throne chariot. It doesn't say who's on the throne chariot. They don't describe God or the emanation of God, but they describe the fact the angels are around this chariot. That goes all the way back to Ezekiel, which is above the vault of the cherubim. And they sing the splendor of the shining vault, which is beneath the seat of glory. The glory is the emanation of God. And when they move forward, the holy angels go back. They emerge among the glorious wheels with the likeness of fire, the spirits of the holiest of holies. Again, very much the language we've seen in Ezekiel. Around them, the likeness of a stream of fire, like electrum, and a luminous substance with glorious colors, wonderfully intermingled, brightly combined. The spirits of the living gods move constantly with the glory of the wonderful chariots. And there is a silent voice of blessing in the uproar of their motion, and they praise the Holy One on returning to their paths. When they rise wonderfully, and when they settle, they are ready. The voice of glad rejoicing becomes silent, and there is silent blessing of the gods here are angels, and all the camps of the angels, and the voices of praise are enthralled and exalt each other in place. So they're in effect celebrating the great worship experience that's taking place in heaven, which I assume they are trying to imitate in their worship service on earth, so that there's continuity between the earthly celebration and the heavenly celebration. And this goes back to the question we were talking about earlier. If in the celebrations we have together, to what extent when we are together are we aware of or experiencing this other dimensions, deeper dimension beyond us, in which the full reality of the presence of God, or whatever name you want to give to it, becomes part of our celebration? That's the big question for worship service. And at Qumran, that's what they were struggling with, because it was in that they gained their own sense of self-importance. The images and the experiences gave them meaning and purpose and identity, and compensated for the fact they had to live in the desert away from the rest of the community. All of that was part of the hope that they lived with. Any questions about any of that? Well, I think, why don't we take 10 minutes and then we'll come back afterwards. And in your groups, discuss with them, what is it about worship that works for you or doesn't work for you? That's the main questions we're going to be concerned about. And whether or not you've been with any angels lately. Okay, Julie?